to start now with our question and answer with Jane Mayer, and this is your chance to find out about dark money, the dark side, whatever. And so Steve Terry, my friend and former colleague, will introduce Jane. Why don't you make your way down there if you can. And Steve started reporting in this building in my era. We had electricity, but it was back in 1965. And we did work out of the crow's nest. Jane is, Steve had the, well, let me tell you first, Steve went on to become founding and managing editor of the Sunday Times-Argus and Rutland Herald, and later managing editor of the Rutland Herald. And while there, he had the good sense, the wisdom to hire Jane Mayer. So, Steve, you go right ahead. Steve's had a career with Green Mountain Power as well as his journalistic career, and so he has touched every possible world in Vermont. Steve and Jane.
Okay, thank you, Tom, and welcome all back from your great lunch. I know it was terrific, but we're really glad to have you here. This will be a real fun part of the day, and before I formally introduce Jane Mayer, and Tom is right, almost 40 years ago I had the privilege of being named managing editor at the Rutland Herald, and lo and behold, one of my almost first jobs was to fill some newsroom vacancies. At the time, if you can believe it, the newsroom had 35 people, editors and reporters at the Rutland Herald. And it was a lively paper that not only had 3 people covering this building, which we'll talk about later, but after I became managing editor and it was time to do some hiring, one of the people that walked in my little hovel that was an office was this young, very, very eager graduate of Yale. And I had known a little bit about her because she had done some work on a Wethersfield Weekly, which was a small family-started paper in Wethersfield. And then she and some of her friends from Yale and other places started a weekly newspaper in Ludlow, Vermont, called the Black River Tribune. So I knew that. I knew that she was eager. And I remember the first time you sat down and talked to me about journalism and about maybe working at the Rutland Herald. The first thing she showed me, which absolutely stunned me, were cartoons. And I said, well, that's interesting. I mean, I knew we had a cartoonist named Jeff Danziger, but so I asked her about that, and she just reminded me today that she used to come in this building before she was at the Herald, correct? Mm-hmm. And she would draw cartoons of politicians in Vermont, and I have to say they were quite good. But what really struck me was the eagerness to become a reporter. And in those days, when you were hired at the Rutland Herald or other small papers, and I think David Motes knows this because, frankly, some years later I was able to hire him too. But you would have to do wonderfully mundane tasks, like going to the Rutland Regional Hospital and copy the names down of the people who were admitted to the hospital to run as in agate type, small type, the hospital news. And then you would have to learn how to spell those long names from West Rutland and other folks. And then you also had to take obituaries, and which was also a task to get things right. From there, Jane was assigned to the city desk. And I think Alan Gilbert was there then. What was the style at the Rutland Herald is that before you were covering Rutland City Hall or this place, you had to go out in the surrounding towns and do things like school boards and local government. I remember when I really knew that we had a star in our newsroom is Jane was assigned to the town of Proctor. And Proctor is a very interesting Vermont town. It has a history of, obviously, workers for years in the marble quarries. Then it has, because Vermont Marble was by then a big, historic, well-known Vermont corporation, and it had a executive class, I should say. And Jane not only was able to see that, but she was able to write a story that described this town that she was covering. And I remember that to this day. Anyway, it was if I say so for myself, it was a great hire. It didn't last too long, about a year. And then Jane went off to the Washington Star. Then, as I followed her career, she went to the Wall Street Journal. You know, part of being a reporter sometimes is just plain luck. It turns out that Jane convinced her editors, I think at the Wall Street Journal, to send her to Berlin to do a story about, and I don't remember what the hook of the story was, candidly, but while she was there, the Berlin Wall came down. Right?
Right.
And so what was supposed to be a 3 or 4 day story turned into a much longer, very important piece. Then the Wall Street Journal moved her to the Washington Bureau. And this is a story that I really appreciate and like, that tells you something about our guest this afternoon. Jane had discovered, this is during the Reagan administration, Jane had discovered that Ronald Reagan in the White House press conferences seemed to call on women wearing red dresses. That, of course, is what Nancy Reagan, I think, that was her favorite dress. So I think her bureau chief, a gentleman named Alan Hunt, who was a very distinguished journalist, I think, if my facts are right, sent her home and told her to put on a red dress. And she did. And lo and behold, when she arrived, or was at the press conference and raised her hand to be recognized, the president called on her, and I think did a number of times. So Jane went from the Wall Street Journal then to the New Yorker magazine in the mid-90s, and there she has done magnificent work. So I think without any, and this is some Vermont pride, we can say we have with us one of the premier investigative journalist in the United States. And her work has been in not only writing for the New Yorker, but she's written 3 or 4 books. I should just make sure that I have them accurate here, but they are the selling of Clarence Thomas, which was Strange Justice, the Dark Side, the inside story of how the war on terror turned into war on American ideals, and Dark Money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. Now, writing books is really hard work. And so I am amazingly both envious of her skills, but amazed at how much she has accomplished and still is. And I suspect maybe she's not writing anything now, but we should look forward to more books in the future, I hope. Anyway, this is your turn, and just raise your hand, and we'll ask Jane. You're going to be the journalist asking questions, and Tom and I will move it along if we think we should. So, who has the first question?
Can I just thank you?
Oh, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you all for having me, and thank you, Stephen C. Terry, for saving me from unemployment. It could have been bad, and you never forget the person who gave you your first job, and I was so thrilled to get actually hired on a real newspaper. It was so generous of him to take that leap and give me that chance. And we had an awfully good time, even when I was writing hospital news. Though I do think I was such a terrible speller, if there hadn't been spell check later in my life, I'm not sure I'd still be a reporter. I probably would have been fired by now. But all those, as you said, all those, especially the obits of the Polish families from Rutland were just an incredible spelling feat. And the thing the thing that people don't always know is that it's not just a privilege and a responsibility to be a reporter, but it's also incredibly fun. And working in that newsroom in Rutland, I could look across the newsroom and see Steve Terry reading my copy. And if it was a good one, I think, did you have like a pipe in those?
I did.
And a pipe, he had a pipe in his mouth. I could see him laughing, and it meant like, great, he loves it. And the good editors you really want to work for, because they're inspiring, they're so enjoying it, and it was infectious. And I was so lucky to have this man for my first editor. So, and I'm sure that idea in Proctor partly came from you. What it was I think the Marble Works were bought out by a Swiss firm, and suddenly I remember describing how there were Mercedes-Benzes whizzing through the streets of Proctor, and the distant owners, and how it was changing everything. So it was really the first story I did about big dark money, in a way, long ago. And so, anyway, it was a wonderful place to work, and the only place I've ever worked where when you were finally done, you could go swimming in the marble quarries afterwards. Thank you so much for all of that.
So, who has the question? Yes, Lauren.
Let me just mention that you have access to microphones.
Right.
You'll need to turn on a little switch next to it, but then you're good to go.
This is my dream come true. I don't have to run for election, but I get to act like a legislator. This is awesome. Jane, I really enjoyed the article you wrote about the Steele dossier, and I was really impressed. Embedded was not the word, but how well you knew the sources. And it seems, could you talk a little bit about cultivating sources in the intelligence community?
So thank you. That was a piece about Christopher Steele, the man who wrote the dossier that that is in some ways the background on the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. And I think the thing the great thing about being at the New Yorker is you can take months to do a story, and that actually took, I think, 3 or 4 months, and several trips to London, which was a real hardship. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to do slow journalism in an age when things move so fast. And I think slow journalism really is the answer to a lot of what's wrong right now, because, whatever number of words that makes a tweet just can't possibly explain anything. But the one way I know to get to the truth is to take some time. And I learned this partly from, there was a great talk I went to by Robert Caro, who's written the just majestic books about LBJ and several other great biographies too. And somebody asked him, how do you get material you get? It's unbelievable. And he said, the one thing it takes is time. And sometimes you have to go back to people several times, many times. In the case of the Steele thing, it was not like Caro where it's taken years, but he was saying, you'll have an interview with someone and you get the feeling they're covering something up, they know more, and they're just not telling you. And you just don't know, like you can't waterboard it out of them. You can't subpoena them. As I said, reporters have subpoena envy. So all you can do is try to have a relationship that takes time till they trust you, until they feel there's a reason to tell you. And so at the New Yorker we get that time, which is, and it's what a lot of places used to do when there was a lot of investigative reporting, but it makes for expensive journalism because they're paying you while you're taking all that time. And so not many places can really afford to do that anymore. But that's what goes into something like the Steele piece. And then by the time you write it, the difference is you feel like you know what you're doing. Because I've been in many situations where I've written things where, God, you're just, praying you're right, and wake up at 3 in the morning thinking, did I forget something? But it's a really careful, deliberate process, like writing a book. So, anyway, but thank you.
And one of the things that I noticed in the New Yorker, and I remember once I was interviewed by a person writing a story on Howard Dean, and the level of people who called me to check the facts, well, I mean, it was really amazing. Does that happen?
Always, yeah. I mean, even the web pieces are fact-checked, but especially the long pieces, and this is why it gets so galling or upsetting to be called fake news. The process behind these stories is so intense and thorough that it's not enough for me to get somebody to tell me something. I need the fact checker needs to call that person back and, in essence, get them to say it again. And they do everything but read them the quote, but they almost read them the quote. And and if the person then backs off of it, the fact checker will call me and says, they say that's not what they said. And either I have a tape, or I have notes that, or sometimes we wind up sort of negotiating something. But there's nothing that you read in that magazine that hasn't gone through this process of double checking with the person. And the checkers are the most overqualified people in that you could ever imagine. It's filled with these amazingly bright recent college grads who speak 5 languages, and you'll say, oh God, I just don't know how to reach somebody in, Serbia, and they'll say, well, I speak it fluently, and let me go get the phone directory, and they know, it's amazing how good they are. And then the pieces are lawyered, the pieces are edited by the articles editor, the copy editors, the and then we actually have an in-house grammarian who will, and I remember the first time I ever got a copy back from the New Yorker, it was back when they still did it in by hand. It was just dripping in red ink. It looked like something had been murdered. And it was, all the split infinitives and everything else. So it's an amazing process, and we feel good about when it comes out. And so,
that's amazing. So just to carry on that theme.
But we also have good cartoons.
Yeah. When you were on, I think, a leave of absence, writing one of your books, how does that process work from a fact-checking process in a book? In a book.
So what I did for all the I think for the last 3 books, there was an earlier one too that was on the Reagan White House. After I did my version of it, I then hired a New Yorker fact checker who is now working as a researcher for the Washington Post, Julie Tate, who is the secret ingredient of many great projects, and hired her to go back through it and fact check it exactly the same way. Because the thing that you do not want to be wrong. You're way out there it's a high wire act, especially if you're trying to hold very powerful people accountable. You don't want to be sued for libel or defamation, and you simply, the whole purpose of it is to get it right. That's, whoever it helps, whoever it hurts. If you're doing a book about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, as I did with my friend Jill Abramson, if it had turned out that Anita Hill was crazy and made it all up, and Clarence Thomas had told, the truth, we certainly would have written that. The whole point is to get it right. And you really, that's what the point of the profession is, and also you literally can't afford to get it wrong because you'll be sued out of existence. So.
Is there a question over here? This side. Michael.
I keep noticing that one of the things in election years is that a lot of newspapers now are doing their own polling, one, and the second thing is that a lot of the news about campaigns focuses on how much money is being raised, not so much even how much is being spent. And I'm wondering if you think that those have a good effect for readers. Is that helpful? Is it distracting? Do you think it creates opinion, or it simply is reporting?
Well, I think probably what you're maybe getting at is that when you see that one candidate is way behind in the polls and has raised no money, there's a tendency to write them off and not give them a chance particularly. And, I have to admit that having come out of Vermont, one of the people who I gave very little chance to, since I'm wildly fallible, in 2016, I certainly didn't see Bernie as being somebody who was going to do as well as he did. It just happened that the message that we had heard for 40 years, if you're coming out of Vermont, suddenly hit the right moment, and it was his moment. But if you had just looked at how much money Bernie raised in the very beginning, or where he was in the polls, he would, if that was the only indicator about whether to write about him, you probably wouldn't have written about him much. The whole thing about polling generally, I find, it's just a snapshot of what people know at that given moment, and I feel like it often has a deleterious effect because it's the opposite of leadership to follow where the numbers are yesterday. And a good politician or a real leader is going to change public opinion. They're going to make public opinion. They're going to tell you things you maybe don't know that you care about. And so when you ask people, which issues do you care about? Well, maybe they care about those because they haven't heard somebody make a great argument for something else. So I think it often, basically polling is all about the status quo. And I think it's given too much weight sometimes.
Is there a question over here? Yes, sir.
I have a what and why kind of question. First, let me thank you for being here at this critical time in our country, to be very honest. And I also thank you for writing Dark Money. That's a seminal book in many, many ways, at least it was for me. My question, why did you choose this profession? What keeps you going as you go forth in the profession? And I raise that in view of the number of negative things which are coming at people in your profession. Last year, I believe it was last year, National Geographic front page said, "Why do we lie?" We find across the country lies have been raised to a high art, quote unquote. I note even in Dark Money, you speak of the subtle and overt attacks against you as you speak to things such as, truth, honesty, purity, respect, caring. Those are the things that I discern when I read your writing. So, why did you choose this profession? What is it that you dip into that continues to sustain you as you be the voice for the voiceless, and also the symbolism there that encourages others to find their voice? Thank you.
Well, thanks. Well, so it wasn't such a big, I didn't have some great plan to do this. In fact, as Steve Terry told you, I showed up at the Herald with a portfolio of cartoons, which is what I thought I was going to try to do. But I still think humor is one of the best ways to take on self-important and corrupt people. I mean, I love the work of the old political cartoonists, and Danziger, I have to say, who had the job that I wanted. Why do this? I mean, I majored in history at Yale. I loved American history. I wanted to be able to see it in the making. I wasn't the kind of person who was going to make it myself. But I wanted to watch it being made and be up close to it. And I guess it's a certain kind of idealism. Some people say that reporters are the last naives. I mean, far from being hard-bitten, I think most of us believe that if we give people the information, democracy will work. And we think that if people are corrupt and we expose it, maybe it'll be less corrupt. And so while I write about these things that seem really depressing to people, whether it's torture during the War on Terror or the incredible amounts of money that are now flowing into American politics, these subjects don't get me down because I feel like if I write this and everybody gets to read it, they're going to change it. And so it's part of a very idealistic feeling thing, and there's nothing better feeling almost than the sense that you might matter and be making things a little bit better. And that's what kind of keeps me going. So that, and also that when I wrote about torture, I did have a teenager at the time, and I could tell her, I do know how to waterboard. And so.
We have yes, ma'am.
Does this work? A number of years ago, we went to a film at the Savoy in Montpelier, and it was called Biko, and it was on the reporter, Steve Biko. And the one thing I remember about that was, he said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, which says a lot, I think. And he was murdered for his reporting, as you probably know. And we base our assumptions on the news that we get. So if we're getting news that's false, then our assumptions are likely to be false. So we were talking about some of this at lunch, and it seems like a lot of the mainstream media news is meant to confuse us. I think of Fox News and this magazine called The Week as examples. And so one person at our table thought we should have critical media literacy so people can help sort this out. But I'm just wondering what thoughts you have on how we can affect this situation to regain something resembling a democracy aside from books like yours and the other works we're hearing about here?
I think critical media literacy is a great idea. I hope they teach it in schools. And I think actually there was a poll or a study that was released earlier this week that said that, interestingly, young people are better at separating out what's true and what's opinion, what's fact and what's opinion than older people are. So it may be that the next generation is going to be a little bit savvier, and that the older generation maybe is more trusting because I mean, the role of the media has been to mediate between, it's between the public and the people that we cover and the information we've got, and to play that role that is discerning about what's true, what's not, and that's what's disappearing because of social media and online reporting. You're losing the mediators, and so the public's going to have to then play that role and be discerning itself and try to figure out what's true and what's garbage, basically. And so I think it's, they teach it in Europe in a number of places, and I think, it's a good idea. Learn how to consider the sources and how to check things and see which websites look for real and which ones are phony baloney. So, I mean, I'm all for that. I think that'd be great.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm actually a really logical follow-up high school English teacher who teaches media literacy. And thank you. I wish you guys were my students. I don't get much of that. At Rice High School in South Burlington. And one of the things that I was thinking about is earlier you said we have to bust the liars. And I think while my students are adept at sorting out information, the issue is caring. And we might know that there is a lot of lying, but it's almost not even newsworthy anymore. So how do we get people, and from my context, particularly high school students, to even care?
I guess what you have to do is explain to them why it matters then. What are these lies? What's the purpose of these lies? One of the first jobs I had after it was my first job at the Wall Street Journal was actually covering the television networks as a business. And it was kind of revelatory to me, and I think a lot of kids would be quite interested to understand that the reason programming is on TV and the reason a lot of stuff is in print is to get their eyeballs to the ads. And so when they're looking at clickbait, I think it would be sort of interesting, I would hope, for them to understand that they are being baited. And what they're trying to do is deliver their eyeballs to something that's making somebody money. It's not even, a lot of the lies are not ideologically driven. They're about profit making by unscrupulous people who are just trying to drag them in so that they can count the clicks and then charge a lot for advertising. And so I think kids, might be interested in, and out of pride want to say, well, I'm not going to be manipulated that way. Just understanding the mechanics and the money behind it, I would hope might be of interest to them. And when you're being told a lie, maybe there's a reason why, and it'd be interesting to talk to them about why.
I wonder if we have any questions from our young audience. So, anybody want to stand up? Okay, how about over here? Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to follow up on that because earlier you said that it was very important to out the lies, and I'd like to know how do journalists approach the question of making sure the lie is outed, so to speak, and not drawing more attention to that so-called fake news and the perpetrator. And particularly, I think this is with respect to the president, because it's one thing to to talk about some of these rogue journalists, but he's the president. We can't just get him off of Twitter.
It's a real problem because if you know, in order to describe what the lie is, you are circulating it further to the million readers of the New Yorker when I put it in print saying, you know, there's a lie. And it's a big debate among reporters what to do with, for instance, Trump's tweets. I was at a dinner with some friends recently where they decided that what we should do is instead of treating each one to sort of dignified news coverage, we should put them in a special little box and then have another little box maybe that's like today's cat video. And then in between them have, and in today's news, the real stuff, you know, I mean, or something like that that sort of miniaturizes them in a way instead of maximizing them. It's hard though, when it's the President of the United States, people have elected him, or at least the Electoral College, you know, he got through that, even if he didn't have the majority of the votes. And so you kind of have to give, you have to acknowledge that he is the elected president and listen to his voice. I actually think we need to bust the lies of the fake news, and not just the president, but I think we need to be tougher when Sean Hannity goes on Fox and suggests that Seth Rich, who was someone who worked for the DNC and was murdered, when he suggests that it was a plot that had something to do with him knowing too much about Hillary, that we really need to expose that kind of lie that's so pernicious and it gets a life of its own, or the lies. I can't tell you how many people I interviewed in 2016 who you talk to them about the candidates and they'd say, well, you know, I don't like Trump, but I really can't vote for Hillary because, you know, she's up to 25. And I'd say, you know, like 25 what? Well, she's murdered 25 people. And people believe this stuff. And where are they getting it from? You know, some of it turns out to have come from Russian intervention. And that did actually make a big difference in the, you know, sort of fringes of the media coverage, which then sort of got recirculated and by bots and by unsuspecting people. But we really got to protect our the information system that we rely on to better. I mean, you know, you can't shut down people in this country because we have a First Amendment and it's dangerous to do so anyway, but we can shame them and expose them and point out that Alex Jones, you can sue them. I think all those things are important to do. Just as if somebody was putting drops of poison in your water system, you would make an effort to try to clean it up because it's just bad for all of us, and we're in a new era where there's this information coming at us that's some of which is fairly poisonous. So I think our role has got to be to expose some of that.
I would make this observation, Jane. I think until several years ago, maybe 2016, but the media, at least in my era, we had no way to deal with a liar. We could not say, John Jones lied. You could say, John Jones said Wednesday X, John Jones said Thursday Y. And then the reader in those days was left to decide. I think one of the most positive things that's happened in journalism in the last several years is the whole checking facts and being ready. You know, I saw in the New York Times the other day, in the lead, basically saying Trump lied. And that's a whole different way, and from my perspective, a positive way, that the media is trying to deal with this avalanche of falsehoods.
I agree. I mean, I also think, though, that we've really got to, I mean, as citizens, really beat up on the social media platforms. I mean, and they will, Facebook will say, we can't, we are just a utility. We're not editors. We're just purveying what comes through, like the lines, and it's not our job. But they need to, if they're able to keep pornography off of it, which they are, then they should also try to do some editing out of stuff that's complete lies, because they have to. I think it's their responsibility, and they've got the money, face it, to hire some editors, a lot of editors. So I think they really need to.
I know we're right at our closing time, but Jane, there is one question I've been dying to ask you. If for some reason we should ever get lucky enough to convince you to come back to Vermont, what is the one story you think you would like to cover?
I just want to go back to cartooning.
Thank you, Jane Mayer, and thank you for giving us a brief moment back in Vermont, and you can always offer cartoons.